Close your eyes for a moment and imagine standing on the southern edge of the great alluvial plain, somewhere between what we now call Eridu and Ur, in the year 4100 BC. The air is thick with humidity carried off the marshlands, heavy with the smell of wet reed and sun-baked clay. The river, still swollen from the spring melt far to the north, moves with a slow and terrible patience, carrying silt that will either nourish or destroy the fields planted along its banks, like you are standing at the edge of the world's first experiment in collective human knowledge, a place where people are beginning to do something that no generation before them has done with such deliberate intent. They are teaching, they are learning, they are passing down, in careful and coded ways, the skills and secrets that separate survival from extinction. And somewhere in the cultural memory of this world, it woven into oral traditions that will eventually find their way into texts like the Book of Enoch and the oldest chapters of Genesis. There is a persistent and haunting idea that knowledge itself was once a gift from beings who were not entirely human, and that some of what they taught was never meant for mortal hands. To understand what sacred knowledge meant in 4100 BC, you first have to understand what knowledge itself looked like in a world without writing, without schools, without any system we would recognize as formal education. This is the late Ubaid period, a time when the communities scattered across southern Mesopotamia are growing larger and more complex with each generation. Eridu, one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements on Earth, has been occupied for nearly 1,000 years by this point. Its temple, a modest mud brick structure that has been rebuilt and enlarged again and again on the same sacred spot, stands as the architectural center of the community. Around it cluster the houses of perhaps 2,000 or 3,000 people, a population that would have seemed impossibly large to the small bands of hunter-gatherers who roamed these same marshlands just a few millennia earlier. And every single one of those people depends, for their daily survival, on knowledge that someone had to discover, refine, and transmit across generations. Think about what it takes just to eat in this world. The grain that feeds these settlements, emmer wheat and barley primarily, does not simply grow because you scatter seeds on the ground. You need to know when to plant based on the river's behavior, how to prepare the soil, how to construct and maintain the small irrigation channels that direct water to the fields without flooding them, how to recognize when a crop is diseased, how to harvest at the right moment before the heat or the birds take what you have grown, how to thresh and winnow and store grain in a way that keeps it from rotting or being devoured by insects. Every one of these steps represents accumulated knowledge refined over centuries of trial and catastrophic error. And none of it is written down. It lives in the hands and voices of the people who do it, passed from parent to child, from elder to apprentice, through demonstration, repetition, and story. Survival depends on understanding. And the survival depends on understanding the river, the sky, the soil, and the seasons. The people who hold that understanding hold a form of power that is almost indistinguishable from the divine. The priest who can predict when the river will flood is not merely observant. To the farmer whose entire family depends on that prediction, he is a conduit to forces beyond human comprehension. The healer who knows which marsh plants reduce fever and which ones kill is not simply experienced. She carries knowledge that seems to operate on the boundary between the natural and the supernatural. And the metal worker, who in this period is just beginning to experiment with native copper found in the northern highlands, who can take a dull stone and transform it through fire into something bright and hard and sharp. Where that person is performing what looks, to the uninitiated, like a miracle. Archaeological evidence from sites across the Ubaid world tells us that specialist knowledge was already becoming concentrated in specific hands by 4100 BC. At Eridu, The temple complex shows signs of centralized storage and redistribution, suggesting that religious authority and economic management were intertwined from the very beginning. At Tel al-Ubaid and nearby sites, we find evidence of increasingly specialized craft production, pottery made on slow wheels with distinctive painted designs, sophisticated textile work, and the earliest experiments in alloying that would eventually lead to true bronze. None of these skills could be acquired casually. They required years of dedicated apprenticeship, and the communities that possessed them guarded that knowledge carefully, because it was, in the most literal sense, their competitive advantage for survival. Us now consider how this world understood itself. These are people who live at the mercy of forces they cannot control and only partially understand. The river floods when it wills. Disease strikes without visible cause. Children die in numbers that would paralyze a modern parent with grief. The average life expectancy, reconstructed from skeletal remains found at sites across southern Mesopotamia, hovered somewhere around 30 to 35 years. And that figure masks an infant mortality rate so severe that perhaps 1 in 3 children did not survive to the age of 5. In a world this fragile, this saturated with unexplained suffering and occasional miraculous abundance, it is entirely natural that people would develop explanatory frameworks that placed knowledge itself in a category beyond the ordinary. If you cannot explain why one healer's remedy works and another's kills, the simplest explanation is that the effective healer received their knowledge from a source that transcends human experience. This is the soil from which the traditions of the Watchers and the Nephilim grow. The Book of Enoch, composed many centuries later but drawing on oral traditions that scholars believe reach back into deep Mesopotamian memory, describes a group of divine beings who descended to earth and taught humanity arts that were previously reserved for the heavens, of adornment and cosmetics, and even the making of weapons. The text treats this transmission as a transgression, a violation of a boundary between divine knowledge and human limitation that was never meant to be crossed. The children born of the union between these beings and human women, the Nephilim, are described as giants of tremendous power and appetite, figures who consumed the resources of the earth and brought chaos to the early world. What is remarkable about this tradition, when you set it against what we know archaeologically about the late 5th millennium BC, is how precisely it mirrors the anxieties that must have accompanied real technological and social transformation. Between roughly 5000 and 4000 BC, the communities of southern Mesopotamia underwent changes so rapid and so profound that they would have been genuinely bewildering to the people living through them. Within a few generations, settlements grew from small villages to proto-urban centers. Craft specialization exploded. Trade networks extended hundreds of kilometers, bringing obsidian from Anatolia, shells from the Gulf, and copper from the Zagros foothills into communities that had previously known only local materials. The temple, once a modest shrine, became a monumental institution at the center of economic and ritual life. People who had lived for millennia in essentially egalitarian bands found themselves in increasingly stratified societies where some families controlled more resources, more knowledge, and more labor than others. Imagine living through that acceleration without any framework for understanding systemic social change. You are a farmer in the hinterland of Eridu, and within your lifetime, you have seen the temple grow to a size your grandparents would not have believed possible. You have seen strangers arrive from distant places carrying materials you have never encountered. Bright stones, unfamiliar metals, pigments that produce colors you have no name for. You have watched certain families accumulate influence and surplus while your own life remains a daily negotiation with hunger and illness. The simplest and most psychologically satisfying explanation available to you is that someone, somewhere, received knowledge that was not meant for ordinary people. and that this forbidden gift is reshaping the world in ways that feel both miraculous and deeply wrong. The notion of forbidden teachings runs like a dark thread through the earliest cultural memories of this region. It appears not only in the Enochic tradition, but in Mesopotamian texts that emerged once writing was finally developed in the late 4th millennium. The Sumerian myth of the Me, the divine decrees that governed all arts, crafts, and social institutions, describes knowledge as something that properly belongs to the gods and is dispensed to humanity only through divine favor or cunning theft. The story of Inanna stealing the Me from Enki, the god of wisdom, and is a narrative about the transfer of sacred knowledge that carries the same ambivalence we find in the Watcher tradition. Knowledge elevates, but it also corrupts. It builds cities, but it also builds weapons. It feeds populations, but it also creates hierarchies where some eat well and others starve. At the ground level of 4100 BC, the tension between shared and restricted knowledge would have been a daily reality. The potter who has mastered a particular firing technique that produces watertight vessels has every incentive to keep that technique within her family or workshop. The loss of that knowledge means the loss of livelihood, status, and the ability to feed her children. The priest who understands the patterns of the river, who has memorized the oral traditions that encode generations of hydrological observation in the language of myth and ritual, holds power precisely because that understanding is not available to everyone. Sacred knowledge is sacred in part because it is scarce. And scarcity is maintained not by divine decree, but by the very human impulse to protect what gives you an advantage in a world where advantage means survival. And yet, knowledge also escapes. It diffuses. It travels along trade routes in the hands of itinerant craftspeople. It crosses linguistic and cultural boundaries when communities raid each other and carry back captives who possess skills their captors lack. It spreads through intermarriage, through the simple act of a potter's daughter marrying into a farming family in a neighboring settlement, and carrying with her techniques her new community has never seen. The archaeological record of the Ubaid period shows a remarkable cultural uniformity across an enormous geographic area, from the Gulf Coast to the foothills of the Taurus Mountains. The same distinctive pottery styles, the same architectural forms, the same burial practices appear at sites separated by hundreds of kilometers. This uniformity is itself evidence of knowledge transmission on a scale that would have seemed, to the people involved, almost supernatural in its reach. Walk through a settlement in this world on an ordinary morning, and you would see knowledge in action at every turn. At the river's edge, Mark, a woman is collecting water in a vessel she shaped and fired herself. Using clay, she knows how to source and temper because her mother taught her. Near the temple, an elder is instructing a group of younger men in the repair of an irrigation channel, explaining in words and gestures the precise angle at which the bank must be cut to control the flow without causing erosion. In a small courtyard shaded by reed matting, a healer is grinding dried roots into a paste, a remedy for the intestinal parasites that afflict nearly every person in the settlement. She learned this preparation from her grandmother, who learned it from hers, a chain of transmission reaching back so many generations that its origin has passed beyond human memory and into the realm of the sacred. And at the edge of the settlement, a trader has arrived from the north, carrying small lumps of raw copper, a material that most people here have never worked with, but that a few specialized craftspeople are beginning to understand can be hammered and heated into shapes that are harder and more durable than stone. Every one of these moments is an act of knowledge transmission, and every one of them carries within it the seed of the anxiety that will eventually crystallize into traditions about forbidden teachings and fallen beings who gave humanity more than it was ready to receive. Because knowledge does not arrive without consequence. The irrigation channel feeds the fields, but also breeds mosquitoes that carry disease. The copper tool cuts more efficiently than stone, but also makes a more lethal weapon. The healer's remedy saves one patient and poisons another because the line between medicine and toxin is vanishingly thin in a pharmacopoeia derived entirely from wild plants whose active compounds vary with season, soil, and preparation. The world of 4100 BC stands at a threshold. Within a few centuries, the processes already underway will accelerate into the urban revolution of the Uruk period, producing the world's first true cities, the first writing systems, the first bureaucracies, the first codified laws. And as that transformation unfolds, the old oral traditions about how knowledge came into the world will be reshaped and elaborated, eventually finding their way into the texts that have survived to reach us. The Watchers descending from heaven, the Nephilim striding across the earth, the forbidden arts of metal and medicine and celestial reading spreading like fire through a world not yet prepared for what they would bring. Today you can stand at the excavated remains of Eridu in modern southern Iraq and look across the same flat, shimmering plain that those early knowledge keepers surveyed 5,000 years ago. The temple mound is still there, layered with the remains of 18 successive building phases, each one raised on the bones of the last. The marshlands to the south still teem with the same reeds that were used for the first shelters. The river, diminished and redirected by modern dams, still carries the same silt. And if you listen carefully, past the wind and the silence of a landscape that has seen empires rise and crumble to dust, you can almost hear the echo of a question that has never stopped being asked since the first time someone taught a skill that changed the world. Was this knowledge earned, or was it given? Was it a blessing or a trespass? And what does it cost us every time we learn something we were not quite ready to know? These are the questions that the people of 4100 BC were already asking in their own way, through their own traditions, and in a world where every new discovery felt like a door opening onto something vast and uncertain. They did not have answers. Neither, if we are honest, do we. But they kept asking, and they kept teaching, and they kept building. And the fact that we are here, 6,000 years later, still wondering about who they were and what they knew, is perhaps the most remarkable testament to the power of knowledge passed from one fragile human hand to another across the unimaginable distance of time. And if there is an era, a place, or an ancient mystery you would like to explore next, share it in the comments. There is always more to uncover, more to reconstruct, more to wonder at in the world that came before ours.